It's amazing how some people just refuse to acknowledge certain very clear and obvious truths that you do not need to be a rocket scientist to understand. Piers Morgan is one of them. If I had to guess, it's because of his desire to continue to promote himself, and his channel, and therefore tries to find a balance so that he can get the crowds to continue listening to him, knowing that the masses are not on the side of Israel, and therefore that would not be very good for his channel. I'm not saying this as cynically. I'm saying this because this is human nature, and I think this is what's going on just from observing him. There's some very basic things. He continues to talk about how the Gazans are innocent and they are victims of Hamas, and that is entirely untrue. There's a reason why in Gaza, right, has been taken over by Hamas, but there haven't been other places, including in the Arab world, of course not in the Western world, but also not in the Arab world, which have been taken over by Hamas. And I'll draw an interesting parallel to London, where he is from. London is actually slowly being taken over. I don't believe it'll ever be taken over as Gaza has been taken over, because at some point, even the English are going to wake up and realize what they permitted in their own country, which is completely taking them over, right? But in Gaza, that didn't happen. And the reason why it didn't happen is because everyone living in Gaza has been indoctrinated. Now, I'm not going to say everyone, 100% of them have bought into the indoctrination. I will say that most definitely have, and I'll show you some future videos to demonstrate that, of just innocent conversations with Gazans about what they believe should be happening in the region with Israel and with Gaza. And they clearly indicate that what they want to happen is Jews have to leave. That's what they believe. And that's the reason why they've all celebrated the way they have. Here's an interesting conversation, again, with Douglas Murray.
And secondly, we are beginning to see protests against Hamas in Gaza. People are being executed for taking part in these, but we are seeing some protests, which would suggest to me that there is a rising groundswell of people in Gaza who do not agree with the doctrine of Hamas, can see how bad it's been for the Palestinian people, for Gaza, and want nothing to do with this. So, I mean, now you've seen how it's blown up. Would you reframe what you said there? Would you clarify it?
I hadn't seen that it had blown up. I'm happy to clarify. No, I never said there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. Of course, I regard children as being innocent civilians, of course. Well, the point I made was there is a lot that we ought to learn outside of this conflict about what it means when you see the events of the 7th, of Israeli hostages being taken into Gaza and being greeted by cheering crowds. I would submit that if a group of terrorists...
Here he's going to bring in a perfect analogy of if this were to happen in a Western country, what would the reaction of the civilians be? That's a great way to compare, just to contrast and show the difference between the civilians in Gaza and civilians in a Western country.
Came into the center of London with a truckload of young women whose tendons they'd cut and who they'd raped, and paraded them through London. I'd like to think that Londoners would be decent enough to stop them, and at least not to stand by and cheer the great rape parade. But that's not what happened in Gaza. And you can go back a lot further and talk about all of the history and the animosity between the sides. But, the citizens of Gaza did have a choice after the withdrawal by Israel of all Jews from Gaza in 2005. They did have a choice on who to vote for. Perhaps unwisely, the George W. Bush administration pushed for elections in Gaza, and as the Palestinian Authority and others were worried about, Hamas won the elections, and they never had another election since. Hamas has obviously used the 18 years it had to misgovern the Gaza, not to create the flourishing Palestinian state they could have created, not to do that, but to indoctrinate their children into hatred, to build tunnels in which they hide their missiles and not their civilians. A member of Hamas was interviewed a few months ago, and it was an Arabic interviewer, I think it was on Al Arabiya.
You have to hear this, what this Hamas member says. They are so blatantly clear about who they are and what they're about.
Said, why don't you allow the Gazan civilians to take shelter in the tunnel network that you've got all across Gaza? And he said, no, but the tunnels aren't for the civilians, they're for our fighters, our terrorists, and our rockets. Well, look, that undoubtedly makes it an incredibly difficult place to operate in militarily. incredibly difficult. And that is what Hamas planned. And I think that Western media, Western observers and others at least have to recognize that. Hamas did this atrocity, started this war, and it knew that whatever way Israel responded, innocent civilians would be harmed. Yes, there would be buildings, including hospitals and others, that would be damaged because Hamas, guess what, operates along none of the rules of war. Israel, like the British Army and the American Army, the IDF has to operate along the rules of war. Hamas not only doesn't operate along those rules, it actually uses the rules against its enemies. And, you've known this since the start of the conflict. I've known it. Many other people have remained woefully ignorant about it. But it has made it inevitable that there would be high civilian casualties. I don't believe they're as high as the figures that Hamas puts out, and which much of the Western media parrots with no problem. But of course there are going to be civilian casualties. And that is the result of the war that Hamas started.
This is exactly Hamas's plan, and they understand this really well. They know that civilians are going to be killed. They know that this most complex situation and the complex ethics of war, because the only way to defeat the enemy is by civilians being killed, and they know exactly how the shallow West is going to respond to this ethical dilemma, and that is unethically. They're going to tell the democracy who they can speak to stop. Instead of saying we have to once and for all end this terror, there's going to be a price for it, but that price will be much smaller than if we permit Hamas to survive. Because how many civilians have been killed over the years because of Hamas? And here's another reality that Piers Morgan doesn't acknowledge. That never mind Gaza, go into the PA, the Palestinian Authority, right, and the West Bank, and see what the people on the street believe there. They all cheer as well. All of them cheer, right? There's hardly an innocent person there. Who in the world are you fooling? Are you living with blinders on? They're innocent. Why? Because they haven't actually killed someone yet? That we have to wait till someone is actually killed? Just see the writing on the wall. Do we have to actually have it played out first? Like another October 7th? How sad, how pathetic Piers Morgan is.